Thank you very much. I'm rising today to join my voice with a growing chorus of citizens and as well as members of the scientific community and colleagues who are deeply disturbed by this CRA to repeal vital wildlife protections from federal land in Alaska. But before I speak on this CRA, I'd like to be clear that I'm not someone who believes that all regulations are good. In fact, I don't believe we should be trying to regulate our way out of all of our problems. I'm proud of the work that I've done with people on both sides of the aisle on an effort to make our government work smarter and more efficiently for the benefit of my constituents in New Jersey as well as all Americans. But today I am profoundly disappointed. Instead of working to create bipartisan policies that will serve all Americans, we are now considering a CRA resolution, unfortunately one of many ones of this type, that prioritizes special interest above the good of the public, and it is deeply unpopular, in fact, with the public at large. I oppose this CRA that would repeal the U.S. Fish and Wildlife rule called the non-subsistence take of wildlife on national wildlife refuges in Alaska. The rule was finalized by the Fish and Wildlife Service in August of 2016 with a clear goal to forever ban unnecessary and extremely cruel methods of killing bears and wolves and other animals on more than 70 million acres of public land managed under our federal National Wildlife Refuge system in Alaska. Let's be clear, when it says the word take, that it prevents the take of wildlife, that means the killing of wildlife. Specifically, the rule prevents inhumane killing of animals on our wildlife refuges, examples of which are the rule prohibits the killing of mother bears and their cubs. It prevents the killing of wolves and pups in their dens. It prohibits using planes to track and kill bears. It prohibits using snares to strangle and kill bears, steel traps to kill bears, and it prohibits baiting and killing of grizzly bears. Why was this rule issued by the Fish and Wildlife Service in the first place? Our national wildlife refuges are public lands that exist for the benefit of all Americans. Refuge lands are managed by the Fish and Wildlife Service for express purpose of conserving natural diversity in wildlife populations. This means that any management activity that favors certain species over others is inconsistent with the goals of the National Wildlife Refuge. It doesn't mean that hunting is not allowed. It is on federal land. Hunting is one of many permitted practices on wildlife refuges, and this rule does not prevent hunting on any wildlife refuge. What is permitted on refuges under this law is the indiscriminate killing of bears. What is prohibited under this law is the indiscriminate killing of bears and wolves in an attempt to boost populations of moose and caribou. Unfortunately, this is exactly how Alaska has been managing its wildlife since 1994 on state and private lands, when it adopted an intensive management strategy for its wildlife that is specifically designed to artificially reduce populations of predators so that hunters might have more prey, more animals to kill. In Alaska, the Fish and Wildlife Service and the state work together to manage wildlife within the National Wildlife Refuge system. However, when any state's wildlife management approach is in direct conflict with the goals of the refuge system, the federal government has the authority, indeed the obligation, to step in and ban certain practices. This is exactly what the Fish and Wildlife did last year when they issued their rule prohibiting this inhumane killing method on 16 federal national wildlife refuges in Alaska. It's important to note that the predator control practices I've described, some of which are currently allowed on certain state and private lands in Alaska, have never, ever been allowed on national wildlife refuges in Alaska. This rule simply clarifies that these practices, even those explicitly authorized under state regulations in Alaska, are never to be used on federal wildlife lands in Alaska, regardless of what's decided to be allowed under the states, under this state law. I've heard concerns and from my colleagues in Alaska that they believe the Fish and Wildlife Service rule triggers a state sovereignty issue by dictating which practices can and cannot be used on federal lands, refuge lands in Alaska. However, I don't believe that this rule conflicts with any of Alaska's state sovereignty. The Fish and Wildlife Service has clear statutory and constitutional authority to prohibit wildlife management practices that are incompatible with the objectives of national wildlife refuges in Alaska, as well as other states, including New Jersey. I have also heard the concerns of my Alaska colleagues that this rule threatens the many Alaskans that rely on subsistence hunting of deer, moose, and caribou to feed themselves and their families. I have sympathy for that concern and believe, again, that this subsistence hunting is not affected. How we know that these predator control practices have never been done on Alaskan refuges before. This argument makes no sense. It is not affecting the subsistence hunting of deer and moose and caribou for them to feed their families. It has never been allowed to go on in the first place. How can these practices be necessary to preserve subsistence hunting when they've never been done before on federal wildlife refuges? I want to be clear about something. Alaska is free to manage its wildlife on state lands and private lands however Alaska chooses. This point is not up for debate, not up for discussion. It is not the subject of the Fish and Wildlife Service's rule in question. The rule only applies to federally owned and federally managed wildlife refuge lands, which must be managed for the benefit of the American public, including the requirement to manage for national diversity of wildlife. As former Fish and Wildlife Director Dan Ashe announced in a press release in August, whenever possible, we prefer to defer to the state of Alaska on regulation of general hunting and trapping of wildlife on national refuges, unless by doing so, we are out of compliance with federal law and policy. This regulation ensures that we comply with our mandates and obligations. But let's move beyond talk of mandates and obligations. The hunting practices banned by this rule are flat out inhumane. They are anathema to the type of thoughtful, humane wildlife management that should be taking place on our national wildlife refuges. In a committee hearing, I asked management experts about this rule last week, and they agreed that these practices were not necessary on wildlife refuges. In fact, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Acting Director, Jim Kurth, who was the former manager for many years of the Arctic Wildlife Refuge in northern Alaska, he testified that the service did not find that the practice prohibited by this rule was in any way necessary. Another witness, Brian Nesvik, chief game warden with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, again, a Republican-invited witness, testified that Wyoming has a different perspective on utilizing national wildlife refuges in their state. The practices discussed in this rule, he said, are not used in Wyoming's wildlife refuges, nor did he make any appeal to use these inhumane practices because they are not necessary. Killing a mother bear or a mother wolf when she has young cubs virtually guarantees that those cubs will not survive, creating a potential for a much broader negative impact on the overall population. Baiting of grizzly bears, which involves putting piles of food out to attract bears in unusually high numbers at the start of hunting season, is literally akin to shooting fish in a barrel. Bear baiting often occurs when bears are desperately searching for those extra calories to store for energy before hibernation. This is an inhumane practice and recognized so by many experts. The use of aircraft hunting, using a plane to track wild animals and then landing to kill them, violates the principle of fair chase in every sense of the word. In fact, killing wolves from aircraft or on the same day that air travel occurred was already prohibited on refuge lands prior to this new rule being issued. The new rule merely extends that to that same protection to bears. Finally, the use of snares. These are these choking traps and steel traps to kill bears is a practice that is particularly troubling. And I'm not alone. A statewide poll of Alaskans themselves shows that nearly 60% of Alaskans oppose trapping and snaring of bears in their state. Charles Darwin called the leg hold trap one of the cruelest devices ever invented by man, stating, quote, "Few men could endure to watch for 5 minutes an animal struggling in a trap with a torn limb. Some will wonder how such cruelty can have been permitted to continue in these days of civilization." That was Charles Darwin decades and decades ago in 1863. I echo them again today. More than 150 years later, such cruelty should not be permitted on federal wildlife refuges of all places. And the Fish and Wildlife Service was absolutely right to permanently protect bears from such cruelty on Alaska's wildlife refuges. I'd like to take a few more moments to talk about the animals that are subject to this rule. Grizzly bears and wolves are the top predators in North America. And with predators in any ecosystem, they play a critical role in maintaining prey populations and in preventing problems like we've actually seen in New Jersey, like the overgrazing and disease that can occur when deer, moose, and caribou grow in high numbers. These charismatic animals also attract huge numbers of tourists to national parks, refuges, and other wild lands in the United States. All across the country, nearly 72 million Americans spend over $50 billion on wildlife watching. And in Alaska, wildlife watchers outnumber hunters by nearly 5 to 1. And they also contribute more than 4 times as much money to the state's economy as hunting does. Put another way, even considering the issue from an economic perspective, these animals are worth far more alive than they are dead, killed by these savage, inhumane practices. There are few values as deeply entrenched in the American culture as conservation. This legacy is our American heritage, and the coexistence of people, wildlife, and wild lands remains a key objective for our public lands today. Americans interact with nature in many different ways on public lands, some through consumption uses like hunting and fishing, others through more hands-off activities like camping and wildlife watching. No single use is more important or more valuable than another. And so public lands should be managed in a way that minimizes conflict across those different uses while allowing for natural diversity. The Fish and Wildlife Service rule does just that. Our wildlife refuges are not game parks, and they should not be managed as though they are. The cruel practice that this rule prohibits, killing mother animals and their babies, and trapping, snaring, and baiting, and aerial hunting of bears are practices that I believe do not align with who we are as a country. They are practices that have no place on our national wildlife refuges in Alaska or any other state. I want to close with something that my friend, Senator Heinrich already mentioned. Many people know that Teddy Roosevelt was an avid hunter, a naturalist, a wildlife enthusiast. When he was president, Roosevelt went on a bear hunting trip in Mississippi. Roosevelt's hunting party cornered a Louisiana black bear. They tied it to a willow tree and suggested that the president shoot it. Viewing this as an extremely unsportsmanlike way to kill a bear, Roosevelt refused to do it. A political cartoonist heard the story and drew a cartoon that celebrated President Roosevelt's decision. A Brooklyn candy shop owner saw the cartoon and decided to create a stuffed toy bear and dedicate it to the president, who refused to engage in this kind of inhumane hunting of a bear. He called it a teddy bear, or Teddy's bear. and little children for generations have been loving them ever since. Teddy Roosevelt knew that using certain methods to kill animals was immoral and wrong. We know this too. Why, with all of the issues going on right now, from health care to tax, all of the issues and urgencies, infrastructure, why are we about to consider a CRA that would literally on our federal lands allow the cruelest type of killing to go on of bears and wolves, their pups in dens? Why? With all going on, that we as Americans would violate our culture and history by allowing the most inhumane, cruel killing practices to go on. Why? With all that we have to do, are we going to allow this to happen? Well, I will not support it, and I stand against it. Our national wildlife refuges are refuges for wildlife, have never allowed these cruel practices, and we should not start now. We should not CRA this rule. I stand strong and firm in honor of our traditions to stand against this CRA. Thank you, and I yield the floor.